Good morning, everyone. Hoping that you are fine. I would like us to begin our topic of today, which is method of grazing. Methods of grazing, yes. Now, grazing is the direct use of pasture by livestock. Grazing is the direct use of pasture by livestock. The different methods of grazing are zero grazing or store feeding. Number two, herding. Then number three, rotational grazing. We begin now by looking at rotational grazing as a method of grazing. In rotational grazing, the piece of land is divided into portions or paddocks. Then the animals are then moved from one portion to another once the pasture is eaten to a restricted level in a given portion. Each portion, a water source must be conveniently located. Advantages of rotational grazing. That is the good thing of rotational grazing. Number one, it helps control livestock diseases. Helps control livestock diseases. Number two, allows time for the pasture to grow during the rest period. Then number three, pasture in the rest areas can be harvested for future use. Then number four, pests are controlled. The second method of rotational grazing is herding. And long before we look at the next method of grazing, we look at disadvantages of rotational grazing. The bad thing about rotational grazing is that it is expensive because the farmer has to build fences and provide water in all paddocks. Then number two, disadvantage number two, it can't be used by a farmer with many animals. It can't be used by a farmer with many animals. The types of rotational grazing. The types of rotational grazing are tethering, strip grazing, paddocking, or paddock grazing. Now, tethering, we begin with the first type of rotational grazing, tethering. In tethering, an animal is tied or tethered to a post, a peg, or a tree. So let's look at advantages of tethering. Number one, it requires less labor. Number two, expensive fencing is not necessary. And then number three, advantage number three, very good use of pasture because grazing is carefully controlled. Now, we move to the disadvantages. We move now to the disadvantages of tethering. Now, one of the disadvantages of tethering is that the animal may choke if not carefully looked at. The disadvantage of tethering is animals may choke if not carefully looked after. That is the only disadvantage that you ought to know. Then we move to another method type of rotational grazing. Number two, strip grazing. Now, strip grazing, animals as in strip grazing, it involves use of strips and a movable fence, and the fence may be electric. electric, temporary, or movable fence. That is strip grazing. Strip grazing involves use of temporary, movable fence. Then tethering, paddocking involves use of permanent fence. Paddocking involves use of permanent fence. And when you look at the three of them, the most expensive is among the three of the types of rotational grazing, the most expensive is strip grazing because it involves use of electric movable fence, and you know how expensive it is to install electricity. Yeah, that is what you need to know about rotational grazing. Then now we move to another method of grazing known as zero grazing. Now, zero grazing is also called stall feeding. It is one of the three methods of grazing, and it is the most expensive method of grazing due to some reasons that we're going to look at as we move on. Number one, zero grazing is also called stall feeding. Animals are kept in an animal house called a stall. The farmer harvests the pasture or fodder and takes it to the animal. Then it is very popular in keeping dairy cows for milk. Like when we talk of dairy cows, we talk of the exotic breeds, the Frisian, the Jersey, and the Ayrshire, among many others. Those are the exotic breeds. They are mainly kept for milk. Then it is common in areas where shambas are small. For example, you may be asked in exam, which is the most suitable method of grazing to be practiced in urban areas like Nairobi. It is zero grazing. I repeat again, zero grazing is the most expensive method of grazing. That is what you should know. Let's look at the advantages of, we look at advantages now of grazing, zero grazing, advantages of zero grazing. Now, the advantages of zero grazing are, number one, livestock cannot get diseases easily since their movement is limited. Now, the feeds are used to the maximum. Many animals can be fed from a very small area. Then manure is easily collected since it is in one place. Then finally, last but not the least, animals can be observed from close quarters. Then the animals are more productive. Remember, those animals that move from one place to another, for example, the indigenous animals, using another method of grazing that we are going to look at, they are less productive. They do not provide a lot of milk because they are mainly kept for meat. They are beef animals. So those are the advantages of zero grazing. Now we look at the disadvantages, the negative things about zero grazing. Let's look at it. Let's look at them. Number one, diseases can easily spread to animals in the same enclosure because stalls might be too close. When we talk of enclosure, I mean the stalls, because the movement of the animal is restricted, therefore it is an enclosure. Then it is expensive to start because stalls have to be built. And remember, apart from stalls have to be built, all veterinary services plus the animal feed must be taken there. And mostly these animals feed on concentrates and the fodder. Remember, types of animal feeds are manifesting as we move on. We have types of animal feeds like we have the pasture, which comprise of grass and legumes. Then number two, we have the fodder, which is grown by a farmer, harvested, cut, and given to the animal. And the fodder may include Guatemala grass and the Napier grass, sweet potato vines, among many others. Then when we move to commercial feeds, also known as concentrates, you need to understand we have the sunflower seeds, we have the salt lick, the bone meal, and the fish meal. They are highly nutritive but lack fiber and the water. That is something you need to know. We have grass and legumes. Legumes include lucerne, clover, desmodium, and glycine. Then we have the grass, the Kikuyu grass, the star grass, the Rhodes grass, the McWenning grass, Nandi Ceteria. Those are types of grasses. So grasses and legumes form the pasture, and we've said in zero grazing, animals mainly relies on fodder and the commercial feeds. Now, number three, it requires a lot of labor, especially in planting, caring, harvesting, and transporting feeds. Due to limited movement, animals do not have the chance to exercise. Remember, that is something you need to understand. Yeah, those are the disadvantages of zero grazing. Disadvantages of zero grazing. Now we move to another method of grazing. Which is called adding. Now, in this type of grazing, that is adding. So you can see in the picture below. In this type of grazing, the farmer guides the animals to where good pasture and water sources are available. Then the animals get good attention and care. Now in adding, you need to understand that animals feed on pasture, purely pasture. That is grass and legumes. Legumes are rich in protein, and we have different types of grasses. We shall look at them. So I've said in adding, animals rely on grass and legumes mostly. Now we look at advantages of adding. What is the good thing with adding? Number one, no huge expenses for fencing or water supply. One adds person can look after hundreds of animals. The labor cost is reduced. Animals are free to move about, so they have plenty of exercise. Number four, the farmer does not have to own a lot of land. Pasture can be rented for use for an agreed period. Animals get to eat a variety of natural pastures. Then finally, animals are not stressed because they experience a natural environment. Yeah. So let us pick up from there tomorrow. Thank you. Grazing. And we looked at the three methods of grazing, whereby we said the first method of grazing was zero grazing or stall feeding. Then number two, another method of grazing is herding, and then rotational grazing. Those are the three methods of grazing. We also defined grazing as the direct use of pasture by livestock. Then we also defined what pasture is. We said pasture has got two definitions. That is a piece of land basically set aside for the purpose of grazing. Number two, mixture of grasses and legumes is also called pasture, whereby we said that grass include Nandi Ceteria, Kikuyu grass, McWenning grass, star grass, Rhodes grass. Legumes, we have lucerne, clover, desmodium, and glycine. Under this method of grazing, known as zero grazing, we said that zero grazing is the most expensive method of grazing. Zero grazing is the most expensive method of grazing. As you know, remember we're having a quick review of what we learned yesterday. So we said zero grazing as a method of grazing is also called stall feeding. It is the most expensive. The animals are kept in an animal house called a stall. The farmer harvests the pasture or fodder and takes it to the animal. And it is very popular in keeping dairy cows for milk. It is common in areas where shambas are small. Yes, zero grazing. Now, we also looked at advantages of zero grazing. We also looked at the advantages of zero grazing, whereby we said that livestock cannot get disease easily since their movement is limited, and the feeds are used to the maximum. Many animals can be fed from a very small area. Manure is easily collected since it is in one place. Animals can be observed from close quarters, and then the animals are more productive. That is advantages. Those are the advantages of zero grazing. Now, we also looked at the disadvantages of zero grazing, whereby we said that diseases can easily spread to animals in the same enclosure because stalls might be too close. Number two, we also said that it is expensive to start because stalls have to be built. Number three, requires a lot of labor, especially in planting, caring, harvesting, and transporting feeds. Due to limited movement, animals do not have chances to exercise. Those are the disadvantages. Those are the disadvantages. Then we also looked at what? Another method of grazing, which is rotational grazing. Now, rotational grazing, we said that in rotational grazing, the piece of land is divided into portions or paddocks. The animals are then moved from one portion to another. Once the pasture is eaten to a restricted level in a given portion, in each portion, a water source must be conveniently located. We looked at advantages of rotational grazing. Advantages are the good things about rotational grazing, whereby we say it helps to control livestock diseases, allows time for the pasture to grow during the rest period. Pasture in the rest areas can be harvested for future use, and then pests are controlled. That is what we looked at. Then we also looked at the disadvantages of rotational grazing. We also looked at disadvantages of rotational grazing, whereby we said it is expensive because the farmer has to build fences and they provide water in all paddocks. Then it can't be used by a farmer with many animals. Now, types of rotational grazing, as you know, we have the strip, tethering, and the paddocking. Strip, tethering, and the paddocking are types of rotational grazing. Rotational grazing is a type of grazing itself. Then we have the three types of rotational grazing. We have tethering, strip grazing, paddocking, or paddock grazing. We started with tethering, whereby we said in tethering, an animal is tied or tethered to a post, a peg, or a tree. We also looked at the advantages of tethering, whereby we said it requires less labor, expensive fencing is not necessary, very good use of pasture because grazing is carefully controlled. And then we also looked at the disadvantages of tethering, whereby we say that if an animal is not looked at carefully, then it can choke using the rope. Yes. Now, we also went as far as looking at the other methods of grazing, the other methods of rotational grazing, such as paddocking, and this is what you ought to know about paddocking. Now, I said in paddocking, animals animals are kept in, animals are put in what? We said in paddocking, animals are put in permanent units called paddocks, and in strip grazing, animals are put in strips, and strip grazing involves use of temporary fence. So the difference between strip grazing and the paddocking is that strip grazing involves use of temporary or movable fence, and the fence can be electric. The fence can be electric. Yes, that is what you need to know. Then we also looked at adding. We also looked at adding as a method of grazing, whereby we say that adding, in this type of grazing, the farmer guides the animals to where good pasture is. Then the animals get good attention and the care. We looked at the advantages of adding, whereby we said that no huge expenses for fencing or water supply. One arts person can look after hundreds of animals. The labor cost is reduced. Then animals are free to move about, so they have plenty of exercise. The farmer does not have to own a lot of land. Pasture can be rented for use for an agreed period. Then animals get to eat a variety of natural pasture. Animals are not stressed because they experience a natural environment. That is quick review of what we looked at yesterday. Number 2,